Hi everyone, my name is Alyssa Umars, and this is going to be a short informational video about the local meat processing capacity grants. We gave a live webinar on February 9th. We had a few technical issues at the beginning of the presentation, so it seemed easier to just record the presentation and post it here. So I just joined the Washington State Department of Ag for the Regional Markets Program. The Regional Markets team works to support small farms and ranches selling their farm-raised goods to Washingtonians. We work to connect farmers and ranchers to information, resources, and opportunities related to marketing and market access. So my role in particular is providing support to small farms and ranches raising and selling meat and poultry products to Washingtonians, and also to the meat processors that they rely on in order to sell to Washington consumers and bring their products to market. So I am going to give an overview of the grant, but I would welcome anyone once you get to the end of this video, if you have any questions, to not hesitate to give me an email or a call. I'm more than happy to answer any kind of questions that folks have. So this is my contact information. It is also all over the website in case you need to access it again later. So I am going to provide an overview of the grant, and here's what we're going to cover. I want to give folks some background and context for this grant program because I think it's important for applicants to understand the purpose and the intent of this grant, as well as some of the constraints that we're operating under. I'll talk about who is eligible and who can apply. I'll talk about the two different grant categories, the small projects grant and the large projects grant. We'll go over timelines, eligible expenses. I want to talk a little bit about evaluation criteria. We do expect this to be a competitive, if not very competitive grant, so applicants will want to hold those in their mind as they are writing their grant applications. I want to give a little bit of a sense of what to expect for those who receive an award, and then I'll talk about a question that we've been getting a lot, which is, well, which grant, the large or small projects, is right for which type of applicant or which type of project. And then at the end of this presentation, I'll talk about some of the common questions that came up during the live webinar. So a little bit of background. Last year, the Washington State Legislature allocated $3.6 million for grants to small and mid-sized meat and poultry processors and slaughterers in Washington to expand their capacity to serve small and mid-sized Washington farmers and ranchers selling directly to Washington consumers. The fundamental purpose of this grant is to increase Washingtonians' access to local farm-raised meat and poultry products, and also to increase the resiliency of our local food systems and supply chains in light of what we have all experienced during COVID. In particular, the grant aims to increase farmers and ranchers' access to livestock slaughter and processing services that they need to be able to access the market opportunities they want to be pursuing. So this grant is really intended for entities that can increase the availability of slaughter and processing services needed by those direct marketing farms and ranches. And at the time, legislators were hearing from their farmer and rancher constituents that they needed better access to slaughtering and processing services of all kinds, but especially USDA processing services to access their markets. So the direction WSDA received from the legislature was to focus, although not exclusively, on increasing farms' access to USDA-inspected processing. So this grant will make investments that expand processing or slaughter capacity or increase the efficiency, food safety, waste management, humane handling, or workforce capabilities of processors. Before we talk about eligible applicants and who can apply, I want to make one note about the budget proviso that funded this grant program. The tight timeline is an element that we have been receiving a lot of feedback on, and it's very valid feedback, but it's not an element that WSDA has control over. The budget proviso that funded this grant program allocated $1.8 million to be spent as grants in this fiscal year, which ends June 30, and $1.8 million to be spent in the next fiscal year, which ends June 2023. Because of the nature of the funding source, which is state operating funds, money that is not spent by the deadline expires and becomes unavailable. And we certainly don't want that to happen, which is why we have divided the grant into two categories: small projects, which are smaller and faster spending, and large projects that require more time, more planning, and more money to complete. But I'll come back to the two grant categories in a minute. So who can apply? Firms, so existing businesses and existing businesses, startup businesses, or farms offering or developing slaughter or processing capacity to serve small and mid-sized direct marketing farms and ranches in Washington are eligible to apply. They must be owned and operated in Washington and have 75 employees or fewer. And all of this information about eligibility is included in the 5-page grant guidelines document that is linked on the grant webpage. And if anyone has any doubts about whether they are eligible, they can always call or email me. So nonprofits and government entities like conservation districts are also eligible to apply, but their project really needs to be directly providing or enabling access to slaughter or processing services or equipment. Firms that do not return the final finished processed meat product to the possession of the farmer, or in the case of custom, to the livestock owner or owners upon completion, are not eligible for this grant. In other words, a firm that is purchasing meat or harvest-ready livestock to sell as part of their own brand is not a candidate for this grant. Again, the intent of the grant is to increase processing services available for small farms that do their own direct marketing and direct-to-consumer sales. So there are two grant categories: small projects, large projects. The main differences are the amount of funding available and the deadline for completing project expenditures. Large projects are specifically intended to increase the availability of USDA-inspected slaughter or processing services for farms. Small project applicants can apply for up to $150,000 for projects that can be completed by June 30 of 2022. So money spent by June 30. The deadline is tight. We know that applicants have important needs that can't be met under this timeline, but they really need to make sure that whatever they're proposing to use grant funds for can be completed by end of June. The deadline to apply for small projects is February 28th. It's not a first come, first served grant. All applications received by the deadline will be considered equally. Although I do appreciate folks who submit applications at least a day or two before the deadline, and please do make sure that you receive an email confirmation from me saying that I have received your application. Large project applicants can apply for $150,000 to $750,000, and they have until June 30 of 2023 to complete project spending. The deadline to apply for large project grants is March 7, and award notices will go out March 15 by email. And those who receive an award will receive a contract from WSDA in pretty short order, outlining the parameters of their grant award. And recipients will want to sign and return that contract to WSDA as quickly as possible. So I'm going to talk about the, well, which grant is right for me question at the very end, because I think that's a place where a lot of folks have questions. I'll also talk a little bit more about new operators and what the expectations are for startups who may not be fully permitted, inspected, or licensed at this time. Eligible expenses include equipment, planning or workforce development costs, or facility improvements. In the grant guidelines, there is a list about a page long of example eligible expenses. Please do take a look there, and don't hesitate to call or email me if you have a question about the eligibility of a proposed expense. One word of advice here: even though an expense may be technically eligible, it doesn't necessarily mean that it aligns with the program intent, which is to increase the availability of processing and slaughter services needed by small farms in order to get their product to market. Ineligible expenses are those that are being paid for by other grant sources or by insurance. Any expenses incurred before a grant recipient signs a contract with WSDA are ineligible. In other words, this grant is not retroactive. It does not cover activities before the date of the signed contract. Any expenditures incurred after the spending deadline in a recipient's contract are also ineligible because, as I mentioned earlier, the grant funding has an expiration date. I want to pause here and highlight some important details about the grant. As I just mentioned, it's not retroactive. It is considered taxable income. It is a reimbursement style grant. So this means that grant recipients must buy the equipment or pay for the work first, and then they will get reimbursed by WSDA. And there are a couple things I want to say here. If you receive a grant award, your contract with WSDA will make clear those expenses for which you can be reimbursed. Reimbursement requests must be made quarterly, but can be made as often as monthly. And it takes WSDA about 30 days to process a payment request. So if you do not have cash on hand to be able to make the proposed project expenditures, you'll need to come up with a financing plan. I'd recommend doing that sooner rather than later, or you risk delaying your project and even losing access to the funding if the project costs are not incurred by the deadline. We have provided a list of suggested resources for applicants, including some wonderful folks at several community lending institutions who know about the grant and are prepared to walk potential borrowers through lending options they have available. So please see the bottom of the grant webpage under the resources section. There is a link that's called Reimbursement Grants and Cash Flow Resources. Lastly, if you do receive an award, and this is a question folks have had, it's mentioned in the grant guidelines, you will need to have an active statewide vendor number. This is a vendor number that all Washington state agencies use for issuing payments, and WSDA can't issue any grant payments unless the recipients have a number. There's no cost to get one. It's not bad to have one, even if you don't receive the grant fund, even if you don't receive a grant in the end, but it does take some time to process those applications. So folks might want to consider applying for a vendor number sooner rather than later. So we've included a link in our frequently asked questions page, which is also underneath the resource section at the bottom of the grant webpage. And if you clicked the frequently asked questions page, you'll find a link to look up whether your firm might already have a statewide vendor number or how you can apply for one if you don't. As I mentioned earlier, we expect funding requests to exceed the funding available, possibly by quite a lot. So applicants will want to make sure that their proposed project aligns closely with the program's intent, which is to increase the availability of slaughter and processing services for small farms and ranches. So applications will be evaluated based on the achievability of the project, the degree to which the project is clear, reasonable, and achievable on the project timeline. Again, applicants really need to propose only those expenditures that are achievable on the tight timeline. Applications will be evaluated based on the impact to the business's viability and the degree to which the proposed project significantly expands their ability to slaughter or process, or increases efficiency, food safety, waste management, humane handling, or workforce capability. Applications will also be evaluated based on their benefit to Washington farms and ranches engaged in direct marketing and who need access to those services in order to access their markets. So the degree to which the proposed project will increase the availability of those services is a very important component of the grant. And special consideration will be given to projects that offer increased access to slaughter, whether USDA inspected or custom, processing services for livestock other than just beef, and access to culturally relevant services like halal, kosher, or services offered in languages other than English. Okay, so a quick overview of what to expect if you are awarded grant funding. And some of this has already been mentioned. And please do take a look at the grant guidelines where all of this information is described in more detail. So March 15th, award letters go out. Applicants find out via email from me whether they have received an award or not. They will get a contract to sign with WSDA and they'll want to return that as quickly as possible. And then they can start spending. Recipients can request reimbursement from WSDA as often as monthly. For small project grants, awardees must submit a final reimbursement request and final project report shortly after June 30 of this year. So all project spending will have to be done by June 30. There's a little bit of time, a few days, really, to submit reports after that date. But all the spending has to be done by June 30. For large projects, awardees must submit quarterly reimbursement requests along with quarterly status reports. And large project grant recipients will also submit a final project report for which WSDA will provide a template. And recipients are obligated to keep records for up to 6 years and make them available to WSDA upon request. And we also reserve the right to conduct on-site audits up to 1 year after the project end. Okay, so we're wrapping up now, actually. I want to talk briefly about which grant category, the small projects or the large projects, is right for what kind of applicant and what kind of project, given their timelines. Please see the link at the bottom of the grant webpage under the resources section that is titled "Which Grant is Right for Me?" Again, if applicants have outstanding questions, they can always call or email me, and my information is on the website as well. The small projects grant is a good fit for projects that can be completed before June 30 of 2022 and cost $150,000 or less. This is a good grant for applicants who are currently WSDA licensed custom processors or slaughterers, for applicants who are farmers or ranchers using the FSIS Retail Exemption. And if you aren't sure what I mean by that, please do take a look at a resource we have linked at the bottom of the grant webpage titled the May 2018 FSIS Guidance on blah, blah, exemptions. That is a whole webinar in and of itself, and we can't go into detail here, but essentially this grant is open to farmers and ranchers, but they really need to be expanding or developing their own capacity to slaughter or cut and wrap. So this grant is not a good fit for farms who outsource processing and are just looking to expand their own product storage or refrigerated delivery capacity. However, for those producers, they should keep a lookout for another WSDA grant that is currently in the pipelines and will be announced in the months to come. It's called the Local Food System Infrastructure and Market Access Grants. And those will be for farmers, processors, food distributors working in the local food system. So no guarantees there, but that program could be a better fit for some operators. Small projects grant is a good fit for WSDA licensed poultry processors. Nonprofit or government entities are also eligible to apply, so long as they are providing or enabling access to processing, slaughter, or equipment. Startups can also apply for the small project grant, but they really need to be anticipating WSDA licensing or operation under the retail exemption during the grant period or shortly after. So I want to talk a little bit more about that. Last one. I've been receiving a lot of inquiries from folks who are somewhere along the path of planning and starting a processing business. And we are anticipating this to be a very competitive grant. And while applications from startups will be considered, they really need to be far enough along that path that it's realistic to be properly inspected, licensed, and permitted within the grant period or shortly after, and that's not more than 6 months after. So that means you really need to be hard at work, not just getting started. You need to be able to demonstrate that you understand the licensing and regulatory requirements, that you're clear on your infrastructure needs, and that you've done an assessment and quantified the demand for your services. So the large project grants is intended for projects that increase the availability of USDA-inspected services to small farms that take more time in planning to complete, but can still be completed by June 30 of 2023 and cost between $150,000 and $750,000. So this grant is a good grant for applicants who are already USDA inspected slaughterers or USDA inspected slaughterers and processors. This grant is not good for applicants who are just USDA inspected processors. That slaughter piece is important. They need to be offering or developing the capacity to offer USDA inspected slaughter. The large grants is also open to WSDA licensed custom processors or slaughterers who are pursuing USDA inspection, but they really need to be anticipating having a grant of inspection during the grant period or shortly after, not more than 12 months after the end of the grant period, which for large project grants is June 30 of 2023. Nonprofits and government entities can also apply for this grant, the large projects grant, so long as they are enabling access to USDA inspected slaughter and processing services. Okay, so I want to go over just a handful of questions that came up during the Q&A. And not to sound like a broken record, but if anyone has any specific questions about the eligibility of their project or anything else about the evaluation criteria, the timeline, and other requirements, they can always call me. There was a question about the reimbursement process. It was, I think folks have a little bit of concern about, potential uncertainties if they are awarded a grant. They pay for things and then they want to be sure that WSDA will reimburse those things that they have purchased. And a recipient of a grant award will receive a clear contract from WSDA outlining those expenses that are approved and eligible for reimbursement, and up to what amount of funding they have available to be reimbursed for. So that contract will hopefully give folks the clarity they need to feel confident in making those purchases and expenditures. There was a question about whether this grant will be offered again in the future. At this time, we don't know that. We have no reason to believe that it will be at this point in time unless the legislature decides to fund it again. So this is the first time, and it could also be the last time that these grants are available. I had a question during the presentation about whether applicants can apply to both grants, and the answer is no, they have to pick. We had a good question about workforce development costs and wanting to understand what that might mean. Folks were wondering if they could use grant funding for payroll costs. Payroll costs are eligible, but not in the sense of day-to-day payroll costs. So an applicant could request funding to pay for the cost of training or payroll costs associated with training. Folks asked if this was an all or nothing grant or if applicants might receive partial funding, and the answer is yes, applicants could receive partial funding. So WSDA would reserve that discretion and would indicate in the contract which expenses are approved and reimbursable. And then finally, someone asked whether an applicant's likelihood of success would be increased by asking for a lesser amount of grant funding. And not necessarily. An applicant's likelihood of success really depends on their project and the proposed project's ability to expand processing services available to small farms and ranches in their region. So just keeping proposed projects really tight and aligned with the program intent and keeping the evaluation criteria in mind will set an applicant up for success.